We're going to look at, what was happening, why it was happening. We're going to do a cast of characters. But one of the things that we have to think about is what was happening in Jerusalem at the time. Is that the Jews were a minority in Jerusalem at that time. The Jews were able to do their religion at the behest of the Romans, who were in charge. So everything that was done had to be done with Roman approval. And so Tiberius Caesar, he was the governor of Jerusalem, and he was in Rome, and he was the one who appointed Pontius Pilate as the governor of Judea. Herod Antipas was the Tetrarch of Galilee, and this is an important thing that I didn't realize, and maybe you'll find this an important point, but I do. And it was that why Jesus had to go in front of Herod. Pilate was the governor of Judea. He was twice taken to trial, and he found him not guilty 4 times and turned him over to the mob to be crucified. Now, Pontius Pilate was interesting. He was the governor of Judea, even though Tiberius Caesar is the governor, then he appointed him the governor. He is the son-in-law of Tiberius Caesar. So Pilate really didn't want to get on the wrong side of Caesar because it could affect his entire life, which it did. So he was responsible for civil, criminal, and military matters in Judea. That was his job. Now, the other cast on the Jewish leadership side is Caiaphas, who is a Sadducee, the son-in-law of Annas, and high priest who presided over the Jewish trial. Then Annas is also a Sadducee, and he's the political boss of Judea. He and his family reigned in Jerusalem as high priest for over 51 years. So he was a high priest, each of his 6 sons was a high priest, and then also his son-in-law, but for 51 years. So he was the boss. And then Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples who betrayed his best friend for 30 pieces of silver. Now, the Jewish leadership, the Great Sanhedrin, was made up of 71 members, including the high priest. Jesus was first tried for blasphemy, and the high priest who charged him was Caiaphas. And so that's the first part. The Pharisees, did I go too many things to the Great Sanhedrin? The Pharisees, another religious group that followed tradition, but they followed religious laws as opposed to God's laws. And they're the ones who made up all of these laws that what was work, who could work, what you could do, what you couldn't do on the Sabbath, how you had to dress, how you didn't. They were the ones who were also making sure that all the laws were going through. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees were unified under their hatred of Rome and their desire to take down the rabbi from Galilee. Why did I missed the slide here, but that's okay. Because the slide was about the Sadducees. They plotted, the Sadducees were the largest group. They made up over 90% of the Sanhedrin. They were completely against. They did not believe in resurrection. They said once you die, you died. There was no heaven. There was no hell. That was it. So what you did is what you did, and it was over. Now Christ is coming back, and he is talking about a resurrection, Well, that's going against about 90% of the Sanhedrin. So they weren't really pleased with Jesus. And then the Pharisees, because he kept breaking laws, and I think of the one that they tried to get him, is that the guys used to walk by the fields on Sunday morning, and they would just take the tops of the grain and they would eat the grain, untoasted, no milk, no sugar, and they would eat the grain, and that was considered work on the Sabbath. So that's one of the reasons that the Pharisees didn't like that. Now, strangely enough, is that in that time, even going back into the Old Testament, is that the outer portions of the fields were not cultivated. They were cultivated, but they weren't really
harvested,
because that was left on the outside edge, was left for the people who walked by, that they were able then to get food for the poor, but it wasn't part of the crop that was, which I thought was interesting. Now, the first law, and we're going to go through these, I think there's 12 or 14 of them, is that there was no warrant for arrest. A warrant was a written authority and required for making arrest, and it could not be issued until a charge had been made by the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin did not charge him. So the very first thing is that the arrest of Jesus was illegal. The second thing is the private examination of Jesus by an Annas was illegal. It was conducted at night, which is a violation of Jewish law. No individual, not even a judge, has the right to question the accused judicially. So, couldn't do that. The private examination of anyone charged with a crime is not permitted by Hebrew law. And then the fourth one, no judge sitting alone could conduct an examination of the accused. The lowest court was known as the Court of Three, and 3 judges who met as a group. So you have a single individual, you have an arrest, you have a single individual who is now questioning Christ. And one of the things that I put on in front of you all is that how the Gospels, how it's in different places, different Gospels, but you'll see that some of them are different than the others. And I just put that there. It's the last week, and it basically does a comparison of where we're going, of where we found it. The unlawful assembly of the Sanhedrin. That was another law that was broken. The Sanhedrin could only be held, no event could it be held on a day before the Sabbath, during the Feast of Passover, or never at night. Now, Jesus was arrested at night in the Garden of Gethsemane. All of this took place before dawn. So even this process couldn't do it, but it was done anyway. There we go. The changing of the false accusations is that the first 2 witnesses were accusing Jesus, saying he would not tear down the temple, and he would tear down the temple and raise it in 3 days. They couldn't agree on what was said, so their testimony was not allowed. And that is typical in the Jewish law, which we kind of get some from. Two credible witnesses had to agree on the story, but they couldn't collaborate. So you have these 2 witnesses, and they couldn't agree what he said. The second accusation was blasphemy, and by the definition of blasphemy consists of cursing God. Well, that's not really true. Jesus in Matthew called himself the Son of Man. He didn't call himself the Son of God. However, in John, in Mark 14, is when asked if he was the Son of the Blessed One, Jesus replied, I am, and then went on to say more. So that is where the blasphemy charge came in. could only be used if it was implied that Jesus had associated himself with God in a way that diminishes God's honor. Now remember, the Jewish culture didn't even like you writing the name of God. And so that was why they came up with the 4 letters for God, which is the abbreviation for Yahweh. So they couldn't write the name of God. So in this particular instance, Caiaphas decided this was blasphemy. And blasphemy, you're supposed to mourn when someone does that. And because they were mourning over the blasphemy of God, he ripped his tunic. Because in mourning, you would rip the tunic. One of the other interesting things today is that in lapels, no one's wearing a jacket, but when you look at lapels of a men's coat, is that you will see a little notch on just about every collar. Well, that notch was put by the Jewish tailors because the clothes were not supposed to be whole. They were supposed to be rended to recognize how your deference to God. So you couldn't have new clothes, it had to be torn someplace. So that little notch today that you see in there, that represents that. So that's the rending of the clothes. The third accusation, he was perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Jesus. Now, how many of you all remember the story of, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and so forth? Well, that didn't stick because there was nobody that could collaborate that. And the fourth was, he stirreth up the people beginning from Galilee. And now this is kind of sort of important when you think about Pilate, is that the only people that could be crucified were slaves, Christians, thieves, deserters, and political enemies. So by moving it to that, is now Pilate has a reason that he can do it, but they're convincing him that he better do it, or they're going to tell Tiberius, and he's going to tell his father-in-law on him, and lo and behold, Pilate would be punished. So he is trying not to do this so that he will not be punished. And in Rome, their punishments were generally severe. Even the best one was severe. Jesus was not allowed witnesses. With all the charges, with the changes in accusation, Jesus was never offered the opportunity to call a witness on his behalf. No conviction on confession alone. Judaic law at the time said it was a fundamental principle of our jurisprudence that no one can bring an accusation against himself. Moreover, a voluntary confession on his part is not admitted as evidence, and therefore not competent to convict unless a legal number of witnesses minutely corroborate his self-accusation. And Jesus did not admit to being the Son of God, except in Mark, when he said, I am. And when he went before Pilate, he said, you say that I am. He did not say he was. And I think in Mark, he said he was the Son of Man. Or in Matthew, he said he was the Son of Man. He did not say he was the Son of God. In Mark, he said he was the Son of God. And when he went before Pilate, he said to him, you say I am. He didn't say he was. So he didn't even convict himself, but they were using that. The requirement of 2 witnesses, sorry, this one gets smaller because there's a lot of stuff on the requirement of 2 witnesses. All criminal cases have no less than 2 witnesses. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, shall he that is worthy of death be put to death, but at the mouth of 1 witness, he shall not be put to death. Yeah. Only 1 eyewitness was permitted to testify. Only competent witnesses could testify. Women could not testify. Slaves, minors, idiots, blind, deaf, mutes, usurers, gamblers, illustrates anyone directly interested in the outcome of the case could not testify. There's a lot of people in there that testified that shouldn't have testified. And not a single witness supported the high priest's charge of blasphemy. So we're at 7. So at any point, it could be done. Now, in talking this, I was talking to someone about this yesterday, and they said, you know, we're still doing a lot of that today. he said, you know, just be mindful it's still happening. And I said, okay, fine. A criminal case where the death sentence is supposed to be pronounced cannot be concluded before the following day. The judges were required to sleep on it before making a decision. And Jesus' trial took 7 hours, all on the same day, no deliberation. If the trial had been held over for the next day, it would have been on the Sabbath, and they couldn't have held the trial. Interesting. See why I thought this is interesting? Now, Molly knows me as she knows that I just love to deal in the minutia. Don't I, Molly?
Yes.
So, the Sanhedrin can't authorize a death penalty. All convictions of capital offense which involved were required to be taken before Pilate. The Romans would not allow the death penalty, and so he had to be. Jesus was found guilty of blasphemy and pronounced the sentence of death. That's when Caiaphas said, blasphemous, we don't need to hear any witnesses, I rent my clothes, and we need to be put to death. Pilate was not told of blasphemy, but rather sedition, perverting the nation, and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar and treason. And Pilate couldn't even find evidence that any of those things were true. The death sentence cannot be unanimous. The unanimous verdict of guilt in a capital case has the effect of an acquittal. By a vote of 50% of the Sanhedrin plus 2 additional members was required before one could be convicted, but a majority vote for acquittal would result in his freedom. Now, the Sanhedrin that was called was 23 members, and 23 members could constitute a quorum, but you needed 50%, and I'm not really good in math, but half of 71 is somewhere north of 35. So you got 23 people making a decision, and you need at least 35 in order to make that happen. And if all agree, which the 23 did, then you're not supposed to have, then you can't impose the death penalty. Sanhedrin members were disqualified. The qualifications of the Sanhedrin judge, nor must there be on the judicial bench either a relation or particular friend or an enemy of either the accused or the accuser. So I'm being accused by Caiaphas, who is the high priest, and my friends are, it just doesn't seem. The judge could not serve if he were an enemy of the accused. Anybody believe Caiaphas was not an enemy of the accused? The judge must not serve if he be related to the accuser. So Annas was his father-in-law. Okay, good. See where I'm going with that. Christ's defense was ignored. The requirements. The judge shall weigh the evidence in the sincerity of their conscience. Then shalt thou inquire and make search and ask diligently. Jesus was not allowed to call witnesses. There were no witnesses against him. And neither he nor any other prisoner under Hebrew laws was ever required to establish his own guilt. So a confession, which is different than our law today, is that if you confess something, you couldn't use that confession to put someone on trial. And I thought that's a very interesting twist of what we've done in the time. It was utterly void. Well, I've whipped through this. This is, but it's okay. We'll have plenty of time for discussion. It was unlawfully arrested, there's no warrant, illegally taken before Annas, not a judge or a high priest. The Sanhedrin were disqualified. They had known enmity toward the prisoner. The Sanhedrin had no rightful law to assemble the night before the feast of Passover. The proceedings were void because the trial started before the charges were filed. The Sanhedrin did not produce two witnesses. The Sanhedrin had no jurisdictions as no charges were filed. They provided no witnesses to establish that Christ was not the Son of God. I thought that was interesting. Because if he's saying he's the Son of God, the witnesses have to say, no, he's not. So how are we going to do that? We're still having some of that debate today, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And 10, the conviction was illegal. The proceedings were one-sided, and Christ was not allowed to call a witness. Christ was convicted on his own admission that he was the Son of God. And we've said, in one instance, it's reported that he did not say he's the Son of God. He said he was the Son of Man. In another place, Caiaphas said, are you the Son of the Almighty? And he said, yes, I am. And when he went to Pilate, Pilate asked him whether or not he was the king, and he said, you say I am. He didn't agree to it. And he said, and how did you know that? Somebody must have told you, because the Romans really didn't care about the Jews and the Jewish religion that much to be that well versed in any part of Jewish law. He was denied the right to set, his trial was started and concluded on the same day, where when you have a death penalty, there's supposed to be, the judge is supposed to deliberate overnight and then come back and do the pronouncement. They couldn't do that because the next day was Passover, and they could not convene the Sanhedrin on Passover. So, rush to judgment. There was a unanimous verdict of guilty of 23, not 37. 15, no right to be taken before Herod, as there were no charges against him. Now, the reason he had to go to Herod was this was a great escape for Pilate, because Pilate was not the governor of Galilee, and so he couldn't really try a Galilean. So that's the reason that Herod got involved, is that Herod just happened to be in Jerusalem at the time, and they said he was a Galilean, and Pilate said, oh, well, he's got to go to Herod. So he went to Herod, and Herod sent him back to Pilate with his blessings. But Herod did not convict him. He's just sitting back to Pilate. But I thought that was interesting. Another way to show that Pilate was a political beast, because if he made a decision on a Galilean, then Herod, who was then a little bit above him, could tell the daddy-in-law, who was Caesar, and Caesar could punish Pilate. So he was a political beast. He was unlawfully condemned to die. The Sanhedrin had no lawful right to condemn anyone to death unless approved by the Roman governor, which I think Pilate ultimately said, take him and do what you want, and that's the end of that. And the Hebrew laws operate to acquit Christ. He should have been released before being taken to Pilate. And 18, Pilate tried 4 times to release Jesus by declaring that he did not find him guilty of any offense. That is what I've been doing for the past month and a half. And I was able to do it in 30 minutes.
Other than that, why do you think the trial was illegal?
Well, other than that, no. Yeah. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? When you just start looking at this, and as I said, is that it's not necessarily my sense of humor that says that, but it doesn't change the outcome. But it just shows that this was preordained, and Jesus had to do this. He acted passively. He didn't defend himself. He did none of the things that you would think he would do, and they still didn't have enough evidence, but they did it anyway. So it had to be preordained. The Romans didn't preordain it. the Sadducees and the Pharisees, said they didn't like it, and they plotted to kill Jesus, and they succeeded. So their plan was, we're going to kill Jesus. They succeeded. God's plan was for Jesus to die so that our sins could be washed away. Therefore, God succeeded.
Bill, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I do not understand the part about it couldn't be unanimous to convict. What is the purpose of that, or do you know?
Just in is that it would look like it's rigged. Is that if everybody walks in and says this, if everybody gets a white ball, there's no black balls, it would just that you have to get 70 people to agree. And they were saying if 70 people or 71 people agree in the Sanhedrin, then something's wrong.
But I think that would cause it to be rigged. You be the one to vote against.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, is that you have the, I've been in some corporate situations where we knew who the no vote was going to be because we said we need a no vote on this, and and we would know who was going to second. So, but that's it didn't seem right, but that's what it was. Anybody else? I just think this is interesting.
Don't you think part of it too was they rushed it so much?
Pardon?
Part of it was they rushed it so much because they were doing
Yeah.
things that, because they were so much under doing the law that it must have been difficult for them to bypass all these things.
Well, remember Caiaphas and Annas picked the 23 people that they wanted.
Yeah.
So when you're trying to stack the vote, you're going to pick the 23 folks. And now some of my biblical scholars are going to have who was you did the study on him.
Nicodemus?
Yeah,
Nicodemus.
Nicodemus.
See, that I can read his mind.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
I can assure you it's a very short book. Nicodemus was a member of the Sanhedrin. You notice Nicodemus wasn't mentioned here. One thing that I read said that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the council, but I haven't been able to say that the Sanhedrin and that council were the same. But Joseph of Arimathea was also not in the 23 that were picked. And remember, 90% of the Sanhedrin at that time were Sadducees. And so I feel pretty certain that Caiaphas and Annas stacked the deck. The deck was fully stacked by the time we got there. Joe, you were going to ask?
Yeah, it seems like the original goal of the Jews was to kill Jesus as quickly as possible and avoid any hubbub that would get the crowd upset.
Right.
Okay, so they planned this kangaroo court where they would bring false witnesses, and none of it worked. They couldn't get a guilty verdict.
They could not get a guilty verdict in the 24 hours.
In the 24 hours.
Yeah, and that's one of the things you look at is that this occurred, I think it's on there, is that the arrest was on Friday night, I think it was, or Christ was in the Gethsemane on Friday night, and the arrest occurred Thursday or Friday. So it's Thursday or Friday, and remember, from that point until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he was dead. Yeah, rush? I think so. No appeals, no nothing.
Somewhere along the way, the crowd got involved.
Well, the crowd, because
And it
Pilate,
became, we got to get rid of this guy because the crowds are clamoring for his death, and Tiberius is going to get upset if we can't control the crowds.
Right, that's what it depicts in a lot of movies and things, like the crowds were demanding that he
Yeah,
be
and so
crucified.
Pilate
Well, you
washes his
see,
Yeah,
hands,
so
I
it-
left
says it
You got
never
to be a-
happened as far as legal
Well,
proceedings.
at
You do what
night,
you
where'd
want.
they get a crowd? So I'm
Well,
guessing that was rigged too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, you see, at dawn, you could have had the crowd, but remember,
Sure.
Pilate just had Pilate had a tradition, if you will, of releasing a political prisoner. And so when Pilate, and maybe this was at dawn, I don't know, you guys who, you've been to, you know, somewhere along the way is that it was in the daylight hours of the morning of Passover. And remember is that Passover begins at sundown of the day that Christ was crucified. So it wasn't Passover. That's always been the trouble. How do you count 3 days? And it's from sundown to sundown.
Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Sunday, right.
Three
There's
days.
also very strong
Those
arguments,
three.
if you study a little bit, there's strong arguments that it was actually Thursday. And that there's 2 Sabbath days a week, okay? And that's where the Catholic calendar guides this thought, okay? But if you study it, you can actually put together that he was crucified on Maundy Thursday, not what the church teaches today.
Right.
And trust me, the Catholic Church was wrong in many, many areas through these years.
Really?
Okay? Yeah, no, and I'm
I
not
know,
here to
I'm-
belittle the
I
Catholic
know.
Church.
But
Time out.
Jesus,
Yeah, time out. Remember, all of this is being recorded.
Oh,
For
The
Passover.
problem is, he just said it has to be, it was 3 days and 3 nights.
yes.
Right.
And you can't count it that way, it doesn't come out.
Yeah, it
3
does
days
not
and
count
3
that way.
nights.
That's right.
But the thing is, where the crowd comes in is that when Pilate was giving the opportunity to release, one of them was Barabbas, and the other one was Jesus. And the crowd went for Barabbas because Barabbas was being held. He was a political prisoner because they said he was a murderer. Yes, he was a murderer, but he murdered because he was trying to overthrow the Roman government. Okay, so he was a political prisoner, one of the ones who could be crucified. And the crowd, and you have to go back and say, the crowd was no longer in Jesus's court because Jesus was supposed to be the Messiah and overthrow Rome, and he didn't. He came in peace. And so therefore, I think in one part of the scripture it says, you know, in the one part it's non sequitur, so I won't say that one, but the crowd turned against Christ, and who's standing there trying to be saved is the guy that the people won't save because he's trying to overthrow Rome, or the guy who is not trying to overthrow Rome. And so that's where the crowd comes in. And that was Pilate's only, I mean, that was his rule. It was not codified anywhere. He just, as a gesture, we're not gonna kill, we'll release one prisoner on Passover. The other thing which is, I think is interesting is if you read, Pilate was ultimately discharged from being the governor of Jerusalem, of Judea, because he killed a lot of Syrians, Samaritans, and Tiberius didn't like that, and then there is some notice in other documents where Pilate became a Christian, and in Eastern Orthodox Church and so forth, Pilate is venerated because of his, even though he crucified Christ, but he's venerated because of the things he did to become as a Christian. And I found that interesting.
Well, his wife is the one who also supposedly instructed him to leave it alone.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
was,
she
her name was
dreamed.
Claudia.
Yeah, had a dream.
She had a bad
Yes.
dream and said, don't do it.
And leave this man alone. But yeah, so there's more to the story behind this, but this guy just did this from the legal perspective, And interestingly, I didn't leave this out, the main characters, that one of the things that he had in the main characters was the unruly mob. And so there's a whole chapter, the unholy mob. Annas was a disreputable political boss of Judea. Caiaphas, the two leading, frenzied. Immediately behind were cowardly members of the Sanhedrin. You know, so so there's another whole group in here that he calls the unholy mob. That's how they got involved. Yes, ma'am.
How, were there no repercussions afterwards? Was there no
It was
oversight
just-
committee or?
It was just a Jew.
It was just tough for them to break all those laws.
They controlled the law, therefore there's no one to convict them. Or convict, yeah. So, you know, and the Romans didn't care. You know, the Romans just didn't care. You know, they allowed Jews to practice Judaism because they were benevolent.
And there's no repercussion for our leaders who do things wrong. None whatsoever. They write and break the law, there's no repercussion.
This is interesting, excuse me. Well, who was the author of that
The
book?
author's name is Earl Wingo. You missed the introduction. Earl Wingo, the only reason I love Earl Wingo, I know nothing about him. You Wikipedia him, there's nothing. The only thing that shows up is he wrote this book, and he was the past president of the Mississippi State Bar Association. My people.
Okay,
So-
thank you.
And there's, when you're in Jerusalem, there's a church. A lot of people don't go to it, but it's called the Church of the Holy, the Gallicantu. And it is built, there's an archaeological dig going there, it's been going for several years now, where they're doing the stairway that led up to it. And inside the church, down in the basement, is a tomb, okay? And on the walls of the tomb, and you go down into the tomb, and this is where they believe that the Christ was held, because this was Caiaphas's
In the
house.
pit.
Right.
Yeah, in the pit. And that tomb, what gives it significance is that there's a Crusader cross carved in the wall, okay, up high. And so that gives it, the Crusaders believe, now that's 800, 900 years later, but they believe this was the place of Caiaphas's home and probably where Christ was held overnight. Now, an overnight, we mean if he was arrested at 1 a.m. till probably
Dawn.
between the trials till dawn. Yeah, and it's if you've been there,
And
it's
where
very.
Peter denied him 3 times.
Yeah, and that's up
What
in the
tradition
courtyard
says.
is
Yeah.
where he denied him 3 times. It's got a magnificent bronze of the 3 witnesses and Peter and the Roman soldier. It's beautiful. When I do the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'll bring a picture of it because it's really cool. But that place, you go in there and it's very quiet and it's nothing but weeping going on in there. It's very, very fascinating because it's very sobering because this is the place many scholars, 99% of scholars believe that's probably where the Christ was held. You know, so always 1% that you can, archaeology, there's always 1%.
But it's amazing.